Watershed. David here with Blair.
Hello.
And we are trying something new today. We're not really sure what we're going to call it yet, depending on what day of the week it comes out. I don't know, maybe it'll be Theological Thursdays or, I don't know, Tension-Filled Tuesdays or...
I like both of these.
Something like that. But really quickly, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking back at a previous Sunday morning sermon as part of our current sermon series and maybe digging a little deeper around an idea or maybe a thought that came out of it that either caused some tension or some disruption or raised questions or, things of that nature.
Yeah. I'm excited that I get to be the initial Tension-Filled Tuesday, or Theological Thursday, because I wanted to talk a little bit more with David about the statement I made 2 weeks ago about being unequally yoked. So what I had said in my talk or sermon was that growing up with the "do not be unequally yoked" verse being thrown around, I had to take a step back and think about it. And so we were talking about this, and I just wanted to give a little context. In my own personal experience and story, I grew up in a house where both of my parents claimed Christianity nominally, but it was not like that. Their essence was not the same. They did not have the same DNA. Integrity was different, character was different, values were different. So there's something there that caused disruption for me in that verse. And so I was thinking maybe it would be kind of cool for us to talk about what the context in Scripture actually was, historical pieces or traditional pieces. Where did that even come from? And why has evangelical Christianity adopted it to be such a strong statement and a rule that is a big part of relationships?
Sure. So, just for some context, at least I suspect for both you and I, and maybe for many of you who are listening, this verse was like the go-to verse to discourage people from what's commonly referred to as missionary dating, which was one of a number of ways that kind of like adolescent dating relationships were policed within kind of an evangelical purity culture context. And so as a discouragement from maybe dating someone outside of the youth group or outside of the church, because of course those relationships are a little easier to monitor and police, this verse might be brought up, this idea of being unequally yoked, being in a relationship with someone who doesn't share a specific set of doctrinal beliefs with you, and then the practical implications of that is like, well, if they don't believe in Jesus the way you do, then they might not believe in abstinence the way you do, and that's just a slippery slope to, pregnancy and death.
Aha!
As they say in Mean Girls. So
exciting. So let's go back to Scripture. So this verse, it shows up, I can't even remember where.
2 Corinthians 6:14, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I knew that. Gosh, David, why'd you take the words out of my mouth? So it shows up in 2 Corinthians. And what the heck are they talking about there?
So, first thing is, I don't believe that they're necessarily categorically talking about like romantic dating, for sure not. That wasn't a thing back then. But romantic partnerships or relationships like a marriage in the same way that we typically do. I think we go that direction, one, for a certain sort of theological convenience and sort of the context that Blair and I were talking about a moment ago. But also, the way it gets translated into English is often coming out as it says partnered or coupled. But I think in context, a better understanding would have been almost like any relationship, especially like a working relationship. So that's the first point. And then the second point I want to make is even back then, like their notions of like marriage, romance, as well as even their notions of faith. So it uses the language of believer in this verse. Don't be unequally yoked with a non-believer, and even the implications of that word believer, we've really warped or morphed them from their original context. Away from what would have been a very cultural and very political understanding to something that's reduced to simply like a certain box checks of like, yes, I believe this, yes, I believe this, yes, I believe this. And so even thinking of it in the way that we do, like, are you a Christian or not a Christian? Like, that didn't even mean the same thing back then as it does to us now.
Interesting. It's a game changer.
A little bit, yeah. And so it raises the question, okay, so if what we've traditionally meant by it, in our context in evangelicalism, if it definitely doesn't mean to us or hasn't meant to us what it meant to them, what do we do? Do we try to adopt their meaning? But then how does that work? Because we live in a totally different world in so many ways.
Yeah. So that's good.
Yeah. So with all that said, coming back, Blair, to your sermon, like with a little bit of that historical context given, like walk us through briefly again, like how you used the verse in the context of your sermon.
So I talked about growing up with the "do not be unequally yoked" verse being thrown around. I had to take a step back and think about it. But in order to establish moving deeper with someone, I talked about wanting to know what's going on deep down. I wanted to know what's important to them. What do they want their life to stand for? What sort of qualities do you want to cultivate even in other people as you go through life? So I really went back to this yoked idea of being about our essence and our values and our DNA and what we are actually seeking, how we seek to show up and to relate with the world around us.
Sure. And so kind of in closing, my argument would be that what Blair just described in her sermon is actually closer to the original context. Even though we're not using, thinking in like binary terms of like Christian or non-Christian or, believer, non-believer, what it's getting at both in scriptures and in Blair's sermon is this idea that, this essence of who you are, and that's a political thing. Because, what I mean by politics is simply the way that we relate to the other people that we are in society with and we're in relationship with. In that sense, everything's political. Your beliefs can't not be political. And so in that kind of more material, practical, political sense, it's less about, are we checking the same sort of belief boxes, and more about, are we ordering our lives in such a way that there's a compatibility here? And that's more of a question of wisdom than rules.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you end up falling into that place of whenever you do create a partnership with somebody, because your values are aligned to a degree, you end up being able to kind of use those nominal terms
Sure.
a little more and share those. But I just know that it's a necessity, like we've been taught
Right.
our entire lives.
I agree.
So maybe you have a question after hearing a sermon, and we would love for you to submit that. You can submit it to David. He's the smartest one on the staff, besides Abby. So, they're both probably about the same. But if you do have a question after a sermon, we would love for you to share that with us. Just something that maybe created tension or pause for you.
Yeah, so shoot any questions you have after any sermons that you hear at Watershed to david@watershedcharlotte.com. And also feel free to comment on this video. As best we can, we might be able to interact with some of the questions around this particular topic or this particular sermon in the comments as well. So thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on the next iteration of whatever we end up calling this.
Yep. All right. Bye, friends.